It was perhaps the most lucrative criminal racket in history. Between 1979 and 1984, the Sicilian Mafia smuggled nearly $2 billion worth of heroin into the US. It made mobsters on both sides of the Atlantic rich. It also led to war. In Sicily, rival bosses fought for control of the heroin trafficking empire. The terror this war unleashed drove one godfather to break omertà, the mafia's sacred code of silence. His act of betrayal would lead to a transatlantic assault on the mafia and make the first serious dent in their worldwide power. Heroin was flooding into the United States in the late 1970s, smuggled inside Italian food products and distributed through pizzerias owned by the Sicilian Mafia. It was known as the Pizza Connection. The US faced an epidemic of heroin addiction. But for American gangsters, heroin meant money, and lots of it. Henry Hill was a mafia drug wholesaler in New York. Later, his life of crime was immortalized in the Hollywood blockbuster, Goodfellas. Hill would pick up heroin from pizzerias owned by Sicilian mafiosi, then supply it to dealers across the city. Even for a low-ranking mobster like Hill, the profits were enormous.
The amount of money that I made was astronomical. I mean, you make $20,000, $30,000 a day at the wholesale. I mean, I'm serious. Shopping bags full. I didn't have places to put the money. And accumulated so quickly, you know, that's a whole nother lifestyle. A whole nother lifestyle, because, you know, you go from, you know, a few $100,000 to millions quickly, you know.
This is where the drugs were coming from. Palermo, the capital of Sicily. In the catacombs beneath the city, bodies lie preserved for posterity. In Palermo, a cult of death has been a tradition for centuries. In the 1980s, death loomed over the island once again. A bloody mafia war was raging. The prize, control of the heroin trade to America. It was a war started by a ferocious mafia gang from the village of Corleone. Corleone was a mafia stronghold set high in the mountains of central Sicily. It was the place that gave its name to Marlon Brando's character in the film The Godfather. The leader of the Corleone crime family was a killer called Totò Riina. Riina became known simply as the Beast. In 1981 and 1982, bodies of Riina's victims were turning up on the streets of Palermo every 3 days. Yet a wall of silence meant bringing the killers to justice was impossible. One night in Corleone, a rival of Riina was shot dead outside the building where the town council was meeting. It was a night that Dino Paternostro remembers clearly.
We went downstairs and found a body on the street. I was only 25 years old, and I said to the mayor, "Let's phone the Carabinieri." He looked straight at me and said, You phone the carabinieri. There was a butcher's shop opposite, and I asked if I could use their phone. They just looked at me and said, no, the phone's out of order.
No one was willing to talk. The police could do little to combat the carnage. That was about to change. In Palermo, 5 magistrates formed a special unit to combat the mafia. The driving force was Judge Giovanni Falcone. Falcone had grown up in a rundown area of old Palermo, an area that had become a breeding ground for future mafiosi. But Falcone was brought up to respect the law, as his sister recalls.
Our parents had a big influence in the way we grew up, particularly in shaping Giovanni's character. Above all, in our household, patriotism and the love of our country were the most important values in life.
Falcone fought the mafia from the Palace of Justice in Palermo. Even here, he lived in fear for his life. The authorities provided him with little protection. Known mafiosi wandered freely through its corridors. Liliana Ferraro was a close friend and colleague of Falcone in the war against the mafia. One day, from her office in the Ministry of Justice in Rome, she paid Falcone a visit.
I
went to Giovanni's office, knocked on the door, and he was just asking an old man to leave. Giovanni seemed very short with him, and I thought this was a bit strange. Later, he explained the man was a known mafia collaborator who'd managed to get into his office.
Falcone had a simple tactic for combating the mafia. Heroin was being smuggled from Sicily to America. Dollars were flowing in the opposite direction. If he could uncover the paper trail of this dirty money, he would be able to mount a criminal case against the mafia's leaders. The trail led to the US, where the American mob sold the heroin smuggled in by the Sicilian mafia. This is home movie footage, shot in Brooklyn in the mid-1950s. But this was no ordinary American family. Dominic Montiglio was raised by his uncle, Nino Gaggi. Gaggi was a senior mobster with the Gambino crime family, one of the most powerful of America's mafia families. Uncle Nino introduced Montiglio to crime. By the late 70s, Montiglio was also a Gambino mobster, using this Manhattan restaurant as a base to deal drugs.
They used to call this restaurant my headquarters. I would sit and do business here, everything from the drug business to my loan shark business. I felt very secure here. I always had a place to stash my weapons.
Montiglio witnessed firsthand how heroin brought together the American and Sicilian mafias, uniting them by a common desire to make money.
When the heroin was involved, the Americans and the Sicilians would hold hands and do the deals, do business together. But other than that, we had very little to do with them.
But mafia bosses faced a dilemma. They loved the money heroin brought, but they feared the long jail sentences handed down for dealing. They were scared that faced with decades in jail, their men would break omertà, the sacred vow of silence.
It was like, don't get caught. You know, we won't ask where the money came from. Just don't get caught. And it wasn't about they had something against dealing drugs. They just had something against the heat that the drugs bring.
The mob bosses were already too late. The heat was just about to arrive. The Sicilian mafia was making billions of dollars a year trafficking heroin into the US. For American crime fighters, it was time to break these Sicilian gangs. It was a fight that took place on the streets, led by men like DEA agent Frank Panessa. Panessa worked deep undercover. Using an assumed surname, he had posed as a taxi driver to infiltrate crime operations in New York. He'd observed Sicilian gangsters from New York driving down to Philadelphia. When two Philadelphia mafiosi were arrested, Panessa told them, "Go to jail or get me in with the Sicilians." Panessa would have to con the Sicilians into thinking he was a mafia godfather.
The two informants that we had selected a restaurant in South Philly, which was a known mob hangout, and we went there for dinner with the Sicilians. I sat in between the two made Italian guys here in Philly, and when the food came out, they would serve me first. And so the Sicilians were looking at this. They knew, men of honor, that I must be somebody.
Panessa's targets were two Sicilian brothers, Paolo and Giovanni Laporta. This DEA surveillance footage, secretly shot outside a pizzeria in Philadelphia, shows them with Panessa. The first step was done. Panessa was in. Now his con took off.
I told them I had an import-export company. And so when they would come down to visit, we would rent trucks, okay? And we'd have the metallic stickums from the side of the trucks, and we would put them on the side of the trucks, and it said, Prima Import-Export, Trevose, Pennsylvania. So when they pull into the parking lot, they would see my fleet of trucks. And they thought, well, this must be a legitimate business.
Panessa upped the ante. He said he also had an office in Germany, which they could use to funnel heroin into the US. Giovanni Laporta was eager to see it for himself. So the DEA arranged for their German counterparts to set up a branch of Panessa's phony business.
In the airport, this big burly German comes up to me and hugs me, and he says, "Frank, so good to see you." I've never met him in my life, you know, and I introduced him. He introduced himself to Giovanni, and we go out to this big Mercedes-Benz that's outside, and he says, "Look what Frank got me for Christmas," you know, and we get into the Mercedes-Benz, and we drive to this company. That's Prima Import-Export. We go in the door, and here's this young, blonde Fraulein comes up to me and hugs me. Says, "Frank, so good to see you. Here are the cookies that you like." And she had a tray of homemade cookies.
Panessa's bold deception paid off. He had uncovered a massive criminal conspiracy. The Laporta brothers told Panessa that they could launder $5 million a day. In other words, over $1 billion a year. And their business was not just confined to heroin. The brothers told him they also controlled 75% of cocaine distribution on the East Coast.
Paolo Laporta came down to Philadelphia, and I met with him in one of the pizza shops, and on the table was 30 kilos of cocaine. And he says, here, take a few kilos. I said, well, you know, I'm not into that. You know, I'm doing the other stuff, meaning the heroin, and I'm not into the coke, you know. And Paulo's, I guess it was his son, it was like a little 6-year-old, was standing there. And I said, I feel in a slang term, I said skumbari, which means I felt itchy that the little kid was down here, you know, and looking at all this dope on the table. And so he said to the little kid, what do you see? And the kid, in true mafia form, said, I see nothing. And that threw me for a loop. He was, you know, mafia in training.
Panessa secretly tracked the Laporta brothers for 9 months as they ferried heroin between Sicily, New York, and Philadelphia. Both men would eventually serve lengthy prison sentences. With such astonishing amounts of money at stake, Panessa was in little doubt what his fate would be if he'd been discovered. Those who got out of line were murdered and their bodies disposed of. Gangster Henry Hill was a regular participant in operations to get rid of the mafia's victims.
We usually buried them. A few times we'd throw them in a fucking lot somewhere, you know, just leave them in the cars and have them chopped up. And just bring the car down to the junkyard, put 2 of them a couple of times in the trunk, and they get smashed and go to Japan and make ashtrays out of them. The easiest places to bury bodies was in our clubs, you know, in the basement, of course. We just dug the hole and right there, and put the body in the lime, and it would disappear in, you know, a matter of months. Forget about it.
This African-American church used to be a mafia bar, run by a killer called Roy DeMeo.
This was probably the most notorious bar in Brooklyn. It was the headquarters for the DeMeo crew. I'd say 70% of their murders were done at this location. You always were scared to be around this crew. I don't care who you were. There was always a certain apprehension.
In Sicily, terror was nothing out of the ordinary. Somewhere on the island lurked the man running the heroin trade to the US, the godfather of the Sicilian mafia, Totò Riina. Riina had murdered his way to the top of the Sicilian mafia to seize control of the heroin trade to the US. Hundreds of people may have been killed on his orders. Few in Sicily had the courage to stand up to him. One who did was prosecuting magistrate Judge Giovanni Falcone. From his office in the Palace of Justice in Palermo, Falcone and a handful of brave colleagues waged a lonely and dangerous war against the mafia.
Pronto? Qui Falcone.
Help was about to arrive. In May 1982, the Italian government sent an army general to Sicily with orders to crush the mafia. But not long after arriving, he was gunned down in the city centre, his young wife by his side. Sicilians rose up in outrage. At their funeral, the coffins of the 2 victims were applauded. But outside the church, the politicians who attended the funeral were jeered and spat on, blamed by ordinary Sicilians for tolerating the mafia for so long. In response, the Italian government finally provided Falcone with the backing he needed. Liliana Ferraro was a long-standing friend and colleague in the fight against the Mafia. The Ministry of Justice in Rome sent her to see what Falcone needed. She was appalled at the conditions that Falcone worked in.
The first thing I noticed was an old metal desk. There was a chair with a leg missing that was totally buried in paperwork, and a pile of files holding it all up. Giovanni said to me, "This is our office. These are our tools. This is our model of efficiency. If you think you can manage here, then fair enough."
Falcone set about his task of fighting Totò Riina with renewed vigour. He was on the verge of a breakthrough. The net was closing in on two godfathers, both of them closely associated with Totò Riina. It sparked a chain of events that would lead to the Mafia's biggest defeat ever. In the United States, FBI agents charged with destroying heroin trafficking from Sicily were onto something. The FBI tapped phone calls made from Knickerbocker Avenue in Brooklyn, home to many suspected Sicilian mafiosi. The Mafia used public phones to arrange their deals, unaware that the FBI had them under observation. This is surveillance footage, secretly recorded by the FBI. But the calls were conducted in the Sicilian dialect, incomprehensible even to most Italians. They were also in code. Shirts, for example, meant heroin. Help was at hand in the form of FBI agent Carmine Russo. Russo was born in Sicily and emigrated to the US as a boy, later joining the FBI. Like the Sicilian prosecutor Giovanni Falcone, he had grown up with a deep loathing of the Mafia. Russo could understand Sicilian and soon picked up mysterious references to the boss of the operation.
He was not being called by his name. He was either called the shepherd, the uncle, the professor, anything other than his name. That, of course, piqued my interest.
Investigators couldn't identify him until the Sicilians made a mistake that blew open the case. On the phone, the Sicilians talked about Italian newspaper reports of the killing of mafiosi in South America. Those reports mentioned a Mafia don called Gaetano Badalamenti. Badalamenti was once a major player, the former boss of the Sicilian Mafia. During the war for control of the Mafia, he had been on the losing side. He had fled to Brazil in fear of his life. From there, he was importing millions of dollars worth of heroin into the US. Surprisingly, it was a business he ran under the orders of the man who had overthrown him as boss, Totò Riina. In Sicily, it was clear, Riina didn't let hatred of an enemy stand in the way of making money.
Once the FBI determined that we were dealing with a former boss of all bosses of the Sicilian Mafia, the goal of the investigation turned its attention to Gaetano Badalamenti.
The investigation heated up. The US Justice Department sent in top crime fighter Richard Martin. Martin was a fluent Italian speaker with years of experience fighting organized crime.
They said, this is like hooking the shark. When you bring the shark onto the boat, you got to be sure that you can kill the shark. And what I meant was, if we bring this guy in, we've got to be sure that we can convict him.
In mid-1983, the FBI made a crucial breakthrough. Agents had become suspicious of a Sicilian pizzeria owner called Pietro Alfano, who lived in the tiny town of Oregon, Illinois, 100 miles west of Chicago. When they ran a check, they made an astonishing discovery.
Hello? Hi, Fradiggio.
Alfano was the nephew of Gaetano Badalamenti. The two Sicilians spoke in code on the phone to arrange heroin deals.
Okay.
But Alfano could never remember what the code was.
I refer to Badalamenti's nephew, Alfano the Buffono, because he was a complete idiot. I mean, Badalamenti was the type of person that talked in code and all that. But Alfano forgot what the codes meant. And he would tell him to go to a certain place, and he couldn't remember what the code was for that place. But Badalamenti didn't have any choice. He depended on him for the distribution out of the Midwest.
The frustration with his nephew boiled over. Badalamenti ordered him to a meeting. In his anger, he blurted out the location, the Spanish capital, Madrid. Law enforcement pounced. In April 1984, both men were arrested by Spanish police. This is footage of them being led away. Badalamenti is the man on the left of this picture. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison, guilty of trafficking $1.6 billion worth of heroin into the US in just 5 years. Investigators had cut the Mafia's main heroin supply line. After that, the trail went cold. Badalamenti refused to break the Mafia's vow of silence.
If you would like to give us the information we require, I'm sure it's possible to come to some arrangement.
He would not betray the Mafia boss controlling the heroin trade to the US, Toto Riina. What happened next would make history. In Brazil, another Mafia don was under arrest. A friend and drug-dealing partner of Badalamenti called Tommaso Buscette. He had also fled Sicily to escape Toto Riina. In Riina's war to seize control of the Mafia, he had killed 2 of Buscette's adult sons. The Italians asked for Buscette's extradition, but he was determined never to return to Italy. He was sure that Riina would kill him and his new family. So he swallowed a vial of strychnine that he had been secretly carrying with him since his arrest. The poison failed. He emerged from a coma and was put on a plane to Italy. Still seriously ill, he had to be helped down the plane steps at Rome airport, protected by a bulletproof blanket. Buscette came to a momentous decision. If the Americans would protect his family, he would wreak his revenge on Riina, but not by the traditional Mafia method of murder.
What he wanted in exchange for cooperating with the Italians, with the Americans, with anybody, was to protect his family. He didn't ask for a reduction of his sentence. He didn't ask for any special treatment. The only thing he wanted was to be sure that his family would be safe.
In Rome, Buscette began to talk. revealing the murderous secrets of the Mafia. Buscette would become the most senior boss ever to break the Mafia's sacred tenet, the vow of silence. He would reveal the secret world of the Mafia to Judge Falcone, the prosecutor who had waged a lonely battle against the Mafia for years. Between July and September 1984, Buscette spoke non-stop. The words spoken here are taken from the actual transcripts of Buscette's interrogation.
All the Palermo families are involved in drug trafficking. The closer you are to the boss, the more profits you keep.
What he was really able to do was describe how the Mafia operated, both in the United States and Sicily, how the two worked together, and how Mafia rules enabled an organization that was spread around the world to function.
Buscette explained that the key to their success was the strict military discipline of the Mafia.
At the head of each family is a capo. He's elected by the men of honor.
Somebody could pick up the phone in Sicily, call Oregon, Illinois, have a 30-second conversation and make a contract that would be binding.
Lower down, soldiers are organized into groups of 10 with a captain over them.
He could explain how different people dotted around the world could take responsibility for different parts of the narcotics business and make it work.
It worked because all mafiosi were bound by an oath taken at a secret initiation ceremony, an oath which, if broken, would have dire consequences.
His finger is pricked, and his blood is spilt on the image of a saint.
He explained that anybody could be a member of the Mafia. You know, it could be a priest, it could be a doctor, it could be anybody, so long as he was male and Sicilian. Once they joined, they were bound by the same rules, and the rules were enforced with death.
The image of a saint is placed on the hand, then lit.
As it burns, the novice says, "May my flesh burn like this saint, if I fail to keep my oath."
Buscette's evidence helped piece together the jigsaw, explaining how a gang of criminals from rural Sicily could run the biggest heroin smuggling operation seen to date in the United States. The law was catching up with the mob. For years, the Sicilian prosecutor Giovanni Falcone had wanted to put the Mafia's leaders on trial. The evidence of Mafia defector Tommaso Buscette gave Falcone the chance. Falcone ordered the arrest of almost 400 mafiosi, bosses and soldiers alike. But Tito Riina, the leader of the Sicilian Mafia, was not one of them. Now the Italians had to find somewhere to try so many people. There was nowhere big or secure enough in the Sicilian capital, Palermo. The Ministry of Justice decided to build a giant concrete bunker inside the central prison. Falcone's friend from the Ministry of Justice in Rome, Liliana Ferraro, was put in charge. She feared if the Mafia found out, they would kill her. Traveling from Rome to Sicily, she went to enormous lengths to stay safe.
Prenotavo l'aereo con un nome diverso, molto elementare.
I booked my flights under a false name, then phoned the foreman of the company building the bunker, and he would pick me up at the airport in his truck. One day I had to go to a funeral in Palermo. I turned up with my black dress covered in builder's dust.
Awaiting the start of the trial, Buscette was being held in a safe house in the United States, protected day and night by the DEA and the FBI. One day he received a visit from his brother-in-law, but the visit had a sinister purpose, as his guard remembers.
Buscette was offered a large amount of money not to give testimony. They wanted him to stop. He told the individual he would not. That individual went back and told him that he would not do it, and they just assassinated him. They killed the messenger for it.
In Palermo, the concrete bunker that would house the trial was ready. The walls of the bunker were made of slabs of reinforced concrete, strong enough to repel a missile attack. Inside the courtroom itself, 30 cells housed the defendants. The most spectacular trial in Mafia history, the Maxi trial, was about to begin. Falcone would lead for the prosecution. The star witness would be Tommaso Buscette.
Quando si seppe che Buscetta
When it was confirmed that Buscette was going to give evidence, we were warned that we could have come under attack from the air. So the skies above the bunker were patrolled 24 hours a day.
The trial began in February 1986. 3,000 armed soldiers guarded the bunker, plus an army tank. Nearly 500 defendants were scheduled for trial, perhaps 10% of the Sicilian Mafia, charged with murder, drug trafficking, and other serious crimes. The defendants repeatedly disrupted the proceedings. Only when Buscette appeared did silence reign. He was on the witness stand for a week, protected by bulletproof glass, repeating what he had already told Judge Falcone.
He really believed that at some point in time, the Sicilians would kill him. He did what he had to do testifying-wise. When we got back on the plane to come to the United States, we were sitting up on top of the 747 in the upper deck, and he said to me, Tony, he said, I didn't believe I was ever coming back.
On the 16th of December 1987, the judge pronounced his verdict. 344 mafiosi were found guilty, receiving a total of nearly 3,000 years in prison. The trial had taken 22 months from beginning to end. The Maxi trial was the crowning moment for Sicilian prosecutor Giovanni Falcone. Italian and American crime fighters had scored stunning successes against the Mafia. It opened the floodgates to mafiosi wishing to flip to the government. Omertà, the vow of silence that for decades had given the Mafia its ruthless discipline, was dying. The jailing of scores of top mafia bosses by American and Italian crime fighters threw the mob into crisis on both sides of the Atlantic. Hundreds of mafiosi were now willing to rat on their former comrades. It was extortion that caught up with Dominic Montiglio. He was arrested at gunpoint in a New York restaurant. The police have been hunting him for years. He was imprisoned in the Metropolitan Correction Center in New York. He knew that his mob bosses were terrified he would testify against them. Montiglio feared for his life.
My attitude was, you know, I'm not going to die in here for nothing and leave a wife and 3 children to fend for themselves. You know, I'm just not going to die for their paranoia that I might talk, you know. So in a funny kind of way, I think that they push you in that direction by their actions. You know, I mean, today it's like if you get arrested, they want to whack you out.
Montiglio was brought up to live and die by the mafia's vow of silence. Now, he decided to cooperate with the law. As a young man, he had seen action in Vietnam. Betraying his family and background would be worse.
Testifying in court is like, I'd rather be doing tours in Vietnam than that, you know, because it's like really, you know, it's hard to explain, you know, when you're up there and they're sitting 15 feet away, all of them staring at you, you know, and it's a tough deal. It really is. It's a tough deal to live with. They brought my 90-year-old grandmother in on crutches, cousins, uncles, aunts. They bring in everyone to shake you up. And, you know, that's like every day going into that courtroom is like the first time. You know, it doesn't get any easier.
Elsewhere in New York, the net closed on other gangsters too. Henry Hill was in big trouble. The FBI wanted to question him about a $6 million airport robbery. The Justice Department wanted to know about the murder of an Italian financier. The Brooklyn Attorney's Office needed information about an unidentified body that had been found. On top of it all, he faced a life sentence for dealing drugs. He decided to cooperate.
The government arrested me as a material witness, and I started to cooperate. Because I knew I would have to do life or get a bullet in the head. Well, I knew I was a dead man.
When they found out, the Sicilians tried to lure him to this Brooklyn pizzeria to have him murdered.
But I still get shivers when I'm standing here. This could have been my resting place. Believe it or not, I'm still nervous. I haven't been nervous in a while. Seriously, I don't know how many of those guys' cousins live in this neighborhood still, you know. These are pockets of, you know, of crews, you know, that are here 50 years, you know. It's changed quite a bit, but there's always someone with their eye out a window over here.
You definitely feel that you've betrayed your background, your family, yourself, you know. I can say that after years, you know, you come to grips with it, but that's not to say that it doesn't bother you.
Montiglio and Hill would spend their subsequent years in witness protection, living in secret locations hundreds of miles from their boyhood homes, always fearing what might happen if their old mafia crews caught up with them.
All in all, that whole experience is something you'd love to forget, but you never could. I mean, I have a recurring dream where I leave Nino's house and his Cadillac is parked in the driveway. And when I walk out the door, I'm walking up the driveway, and Nino, Roy, Chris, Anthony, Joey, they're all hidden under Nino's Cadillac. And as I'm walking by, Roy looks at me and goes, "Hey, Dominic, come to hell with us. And then the dream stops.
The heroin trafficking empire, built up over several decades by the Mafia, was dealt a massive blow. Off the coast of Sicily, Italian police search fishing boats for drugs. They find very little. But on both sides of the Atlantic, the war against the Mafia was far from over. During his interrogation by Falcone, Mafia defector Tommaso Buscette had a warning for the Sicilian prosecutor. The Mafia would stop at nothing to kill him.
Never forget, when you open an account with the Mafia, it will only be settled when you die.
Hundreds of mafiosi had been sent to jail in the Maxi trial. But the boss of bosses, Totò Riina, was still free. He still controlled his vast criminal empire. He still murdered his rivals. In the US, the pizza connection had been destroyed by the biggest FBI effort ever. 21 Sicilian heroin traffickers had been jailed for sentences of up to 45 years each. Never again would the Sicilian and the American mafias work so closely together.